We've previously looked at the electrophilic addition of hydrogen halides to alkenes, and it's time now to look more closely at these reactions. So looking back, we introduced these reactions with the reaction of simple hydrogen halides to alkenes and made the notation at the time that these reactions occur regioselectively. And we also noted that there was a difference in reactivity between the hydrogen halides that follows the order that you see here, hydrogen iodide being the most reactive of the hydrogen halides, and then the reactivity drops off. Hydrogen fluoride is very, very slow to undergo these reactions. So from a practical sense, the hydrogen iodide, hydrogen bromide, hydrogen chloride are reasonable to use in a laboratory. The reaction is regioselective, and if we look at the specific examples below, you can see that in each case, we are producing the product where the halogen is attached to the more substituted carbon. This is a tertiary carbon in the structure, rather than the chlorine adding to the primary carbon of the alkene. In the alkene below, we have a tertiary carbon and a secondary carbon, and the major product that is produced has the bromine, again, added to the more substituted tertiary carbon rather than the secondary carbon. The hydrogen in each structure is added to the other end of the double bond. So if you look at the first example, the hydrogen adds to the less substituted carbon. This is now a CH3 group. And in the bond line formula below, it's a little less obvious, but there's a single hydrogen on the secondary carbon, but in the product there are two hydrogens. So one of those came from the hydrogen bromide. We drew the mechanism for this reaction previously, and it's worth reviewing, and we're going to look at some of the some additional details as we move forward. So mechanistically, we have an alkene reacting with, in this case, hydrogen chloride. It's called an electrophilic addition because the reactant, hydrogen chloride, is acting as an electrophile, and the alkene is acting as a nucleophile. So it's the pi electrons from the alkene that are donated to the electrophilic hydrogen of the hydrogen halide that ruptures the halogen bond and produces a carbocation. And the preferences for the formation of the most stable carbocation, in this case the secondary carbocation, rather than protonating at the secondary carbon and producing an unheard of primary carbocation. The reaction finishes by simply addition of the chloride ion to the carbocation to give this secondary alkyl chloride. So again, the alkene pi electrons are acting as the nucleophile. So the highest occupied molecular orbital of the alkene would be the pi orbital. And in the case of the hydrogen chloride, the LUMO is the sigma star of the hydrogen chlorine bond. And so you'll notice our electrons go from the pi bond to the hydrogen. That causes breakage of the hydrogen chlorine bond, with those electrons going with chlorine to become a chloride ion. And then this is a simple donation of electron pair into an empty p orbital. So the HOMO in this step is the electron pair on chlorine, and the LUMO is the empty p orbital of the carbocation. When we looked at this previously, we noted that the regioselectivity was an observation made by a Russian chemist by the name of Markovnikov, and is simply known as Markovnikov's rule. It's stated in various ways, but one way of stating it is that the more substituted halide is formed in these reactions. We now know that the origin of the rule is the formation of the more stable carbocation intermediate. And so if you think of an unsymmetrical, look down here in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, we have an unsymmetrical alkene, primary carbon and a secondary carbon. There are in principle two different protonations that can occur. We can either protonate the primary carbon or we can protonate the secondary carbon. So if you follow the red line, this is protonation of the primary carbon. The transition state would look something akin to this, where the pi electrons are starting to, the pi bond is starting to break. We're donating those electrons to the hydrogen. We're starting to break the hydrogen-halogen bond. And we also have developing charge. In this case, we're developing positive charge on this secondary carbon. The alternative pathway is shown by the blue dotted line, where protonation occurs on the secondary carbon, and that would entail forming a partial positive charge on the primary carbon. That's a much less stable situation and thus higher in energy, and the activation energy to it is higher. So not only is this a less stable intermediate, it would be formed more slowly. And so the preference is the reaction proceeds through the secondary carbocation rather than the primary onto the product. And the product we observe in the reaction is that where the halogen is attached to the more substituted carbon. There are other factors that can control the regioselectivity, but it generally comes down to stability of the carbocation. So for instance, if you have some sort of generically unsymmetrical alkene, there are in principle two different intermediates and two different products that can form. So in this case, the X's are just to differentiate this end for the alkene from the other end of the alkene. So they're somehow different between the two. And so the question is there a preference for this carbocation, or is there a preference for the other carbocation? And those are going to lead to different products. So we're going to look at a couple examples of what can control that regioselectivity and the stability of the intermediate carbocation. The first one is this, where we have vinyl chloride. So we have an unsymmetrical alkene, and in this case, we don't have primary or secondary or tertiary carbons. We have primary carbons. One of those has hydrogens attached, the other one has chlorines attached. If you carry out the electrophilic addition using hydrogen chloride on vinyl chloride, you produce exclusively 1,1-dichloroethane. The chlorine adds to the carbon that bears the chlorine to begin with, and the hydrogen adds to the carbon that has the two hydrogens on it. So we don't observe any of the 1,2-dichloro product. So why would this be? Well, in order to understand, we need to look at the possible carbocation intermediates. And we can draw those. And so if you think about the addition or the protonation of this double bond, we can either protonate the carbon that bears the two hydrogens, producing the carbocation adjacent to the chlorine, or we can protonate on the carbon that the chlorine is attached to, and that would produce this carbocation. Now, if we look at the product, it's pretty clear that it must be proceeding through the carbocation where the positive charge is next to the chlorine rather than the alternative. And the alternative should look bad to you. This is a primary carbocation. We would never invoke that in a mechanism. So what is it about this carbocation where the chlorine is attached to that positively charged carbon that makes it preferentially formed? And the answer is resonance. If you look at the structure of this, the lone pairs of electrons on the chlorine atom can participate in a resonance delocalization of the positive charge. We can take a pair of electrons and form a double bond in a structure, and we get a pair of resonance contributors. And that's telling us that we're getting delocalization of that positive charge across the carbon and the chlorine. An alternative way of thinking about it is from a molecular orbital point of view. How can the orbitals, the filled orbital on chlorine, be interacting with the empty orbital on the carbocation? And the answer is in the formation of some sort of pi interaction. It turns out the lone pairs on chlorine lie in p orbitals, and as you're aware, carbocations have an empty p orbital. And so there, in a sense, is a homo-lumo sort of interaction where the homo is the 3p electrons on chlorine interacting with the 2p orbital on carbon, and that interaction is producing a partial pi bond and thus stabilizing the structure. And so again, we're seeing the regioselectivity of the reaction is being controlled by the stability of the possible carbocation intermediates. Let's look at another scenario where regioselectivity comes into play, and the intermediates tell us why the product distribution is what it is. So in this example, we have 1,3-butadiene, so 4-carbon chain with 2 double bonds, double bond between carbons 1 and 2, and a double bond between carbons 3 and 4. When one carries out the electrophilic addition of one equivalent of hydrogen bromide to this compound at low temperature, the product mixture that you see here is produced. We end up with 71% of the bromine added at this position, and we end up with 29% of the bromine added to this position. Now this should look unusual to you because, especially the second compound, because we now have a double bond between carbons 2 and 3, and there was no double bond between carbon 3 initially. So what in the world is going on? Why is this the major product, and how in the world do we end up with the bromine at one end and a double bond in the middle of the molecule? So again, we need to think mechanistically. This is an electrophilic addition, so one of the pi bonds acts as our nucleophile. The HBr is the electrophile, and so we're going to protonate this selectively. And the question is, where do we protonate? And it turns out the most stable carbocation is formed when we protonate at one of the ends here. That generates a positive charge at this position. But hopefully by now you're aware that when you have a positive charge next to a pi bond, there is a resonance contributor to that. And that resonance, that means then we have delocalization of that positive charge over the carbon here and this carbon at the end. And ultimately, we see reaction at both sites. There is a preference for addition of the bromine to this position, but we also see a significant amount of bromide adding to the primary position here. So this is not a true primary carbocation, this is an allylic carbocation. And remember that when we think about resonance structures, neither of these is real, the hybrid of the two is. And so we have partial positive charge both at the secondary position and at the primary position. And this is a viable structure because it's delocalized charge. Now, you might also say, well, why are we getting more of this product than we are? If we go back and look at these resonance contributors, we would not rank them equally. We wouldn't say that our picture, our hybrid picture, is exactly half this and half that. And the reason we wouldn't is if we kind of evaluate the separate structures by themselves, we'd say, looking at this structure by itself, this is a secondary carbocation, but looking at the other structure by itself, this is a primary carbocation. So based on relative carbocation stability, one would draw the conclusion that the structure with the positive charge on the secondary carbon is a greater contributor to our hybrid picture of the two. So the way of thinking about it is there's more positive charge on the secondary carbon, there's less positive charge on the primary carbon, and the result is we don't get a 50-50 mixture, we get more product from reaction at that secondary carbon. So looking a little more closely at this, there you can think about it from a molecular orbital point of view. So here are our resonance structures that we evaluated on the previous slide. If we try to create a picture in our minds of what the hybrid of the two is, there are a couple different ways of drawing that. You might draw this and say, well, that positive charge is delocalized over those 3 carbons. Or because the 2 structures only have positive charge at the secondary and the primary position, you might draw a structure like this that says, all right, we've got partial charge. That's what the parentheses around the positive charges mean, that we have positive charges at each position. But a more sophisticated look at this actually calculates the molecular orbitals of this cation. And when one calculates the molecular orbitals of an allyl cation, we find that there is true delocalization of electrons along that 3-carbon unit. And that's where the one pair of electrons, so in these there's a single pair of electrons in a pi orbital, and the resonance picture says that those 2 electrons are spread across 3 atoms. And that is indicated by this molecular orbital, where we have lobes of that molecular orbital that span all 3 atoms. So from a schematic point of view, it's the combination of three p orbitals that give rise to a molecular orbital. But this is not the orbital that reacts. Remember, the next step in the mechanism is attack of the nucleophile. So this is acting as the LUMO in a HOMO-LUMO interaction, and the halide ion attacking this is the highest occupied molecular orbital. And so where would the halide ion donate its electrons? And the answer is to the LUMO of this structure. And the LUMO of the structure is shown here. This is the calculated molecular orbital for the pi or the antibond of this three atom delocalized structure. And you'll notice that there are only lobes here on the terminal carbons of this three carbon unit. We've eliminated the methyl group that's in the structure up here, by the way, and it's a perfectly reasonable assumption. And so if the halide is going to react with this, it's either going to react at this carbon or that carbon. So that's what our resonance picture tells us, that the bromide is either reacting at the secondary carbon or at the primary carbon. It's not reacting at the carbon in the middle.